Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey, and with me today I have
Kurtis Chen. I'm an intern architect in Toronto, and I'm also a volunteer with the Toronto Society of Architects. And I've been leading the Pride initiatives at the TSA now for over 4 years.
And I'm Joy Leon. I'm the program director for the Toronto Society of Architects.
And let's start with that. Pride just happened in Toronto, and you guys were part of the proceedings. And what you did was you sort of highlighted LGBTQ spaces in the historical context and otherwise in Toronto. So maybe you could explain what you were doing in the Pride parade itself and the Pride events otherwise, and then we'll kind of go into the built spaces.
This being our 4th year, this is the second time that we've actually marched in the actual parade. Mm-hmm. Of course, COVID kind of made marching in a parade difficult the last couple of years. But this year, we've returned to the parade, and this time we've already in previous years, we've taken a look at queer spaces a little bit. We've done some programming related to looking at it and sharing queer spaces on social media. But this year it felt like the right time to sort of really put more of a highlight on it and to actually bring it to the parade. So this year we've put together
36.
A good number of queer spaces, and we basically drew them out in elevation and cut them out. So we had these big, they kind of look like protest signs, but we cut out these giant pink and black elevations of buildings and put them on picketing posts and kind of marched down Yonge Street with them during the Pride Parade to sort of celebrate the spaces that still exist, the queer spaces that still exist, and then also to sort of commemorate a lot of the queer spaces that we've lost.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth mentioning that in kind of parallel to kind of participating in the parade and displaying them, these spaces kind of marching down Yonge Street, we did an Instagram series on the same day where we actually gave a little bit about the history of each of these spaces and why they matter as part of kind of an Instagram stories. And we have found, we're trying to blend the best of virtual that we've learned in the last 2 years with kind of the best of in person. So a little bit of marching and a little bit of virtual tour all combined into one.
And to get into the history of it, I guess I'd like to know what were the first queer spaces in Toronto, and also since it wasn't just a marginalized group of people, it was a secret. You had to be a secret group of people. So how did that affect the actual built spaces people were in?
Yeah, I mean that's actually it's really interesting when you're starting to research queer spaces because unfortunately, the way you find them is finding people complaining about them or talking about how they are a disease on the city. So that is how we were able to uncover, for example, the Letros Tavern. That is the oldest queer space we were able to identify in our research. That's a 1940s tavern that was across the King Edward Hotel here in Toronto. And it was the basement, of course, that was the host of these queer spaces. And a lot of queer spaces started in basements or unmarked doors where you had to know that it was a queer space. And so what's really interesting is you're tracking the buildings and the evolution of them is it's all about these queer spaces becoming more visible, starting to first, heritage structures that are in disuse, giving them new life, and then slowly evolving to the most recent ones, which are purpose built to express their queerness, which is kind of really interesting to see that Toronto really is home to one of the few places where you can find queer spaces that are designed to look queer and actually express their queerness to the public.
Oh, and that being something that came from the stakeholders too, right? Like this, I think the example that Joelle's talking about is the Friends of Ruby shelter, which was the first purpose-built LGBTQ 2S+ youth shelter in the country. And I think I remember meeting with the project architect behind it, Paul Dowsett, and speaking about how the stakeholders that they interviewed for it were initially, I think the assumption from the architect was that maybe we want a space that isn't as explicitly queer from the outside because, it's a shelter, maybe people aren't out as you're going to the shelter, but it turns out that even the occupants of the building were actually really gung-ho about expressing the queerness of the space within on the outside of the building, which is, obviously like a complete 180 from from hiding a queer bar in your basement.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I was going to ask, and I don't want to erase any of the history here. I want to go back to that afterwards, but I'd like to ask about this specific building. What is it that makes it, I mean, other than the obvious that queer people are using it as a space, what is it that makes it a queer space in terms of design?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I mean, there's some aspects that are interior, and we find this through across quite a few of the contemporary queer spaces. So the Friends of Ruby, but also the 519 edition by Conchenier Architects. The usually, some of them are things like having all gendered washrooms, or thinking about couples and being kind of broad in a shelter of who is a couple, and just being open to different kinds of family relationships. But in the case of 519, the outside has a big rainbow. And that was really interesting when we've talked to kind of architects that are designing for these spaces. At first, there's always like, oh, we really don't want to use a rainbow because, that is such an obvious symbol. But it is, at the end of the day, kind of the symbol that perpetuates throughout almost all of these queer spaces is you find a rainbow. In the 519, it's a little bit more discreet. It's about places that are maybe more closed off, less windows, so it feels more intimate, and other places that are loud and proud and super visible, so you can see what's happening on the inside. So the interesting thing about queerness is that there's not a single way of defining it or visualizing it, and so it becomes very individual to these buildings. Each building is really unique, much like queerness itself, and every person has a different version of what queerness means to them.
Yeah, I think you meant to say the Friends of Ruby shelter has the rainbow on the outside. Yeah.
Just to go back to the history of it, one thing I was thinking about is I would assume that, as historically speaking, things were sort of scattered and maybe in poorer neighborhoods because the rent was lower, but I might be wrong about that. But then Church Street became sort of a hub, and was that an ad hoc process, or how did that come to be? I guess architecturally speaking.
Yeah, that was a bit of the right ingredients at the exact right time, and a lot of luck. When the Letros stopped being kind of the center for queer life in the city, and it was around the same time that we're seeing the subway being built on Yonge Street. We're seeing high density residential, City Park, the first modern downtown high-rise building in Toronto. These all elements kind of came together to make kind of that area of Yonge Street actually the center for queer life. The Village started happening a little bit later, towards the 80s, as they were seeking cheaper rent. Church Street was an area that had always been noted for redevelopment, but it never quite happened. And so you ended up with this really great mix of very high density residential mid-block, with very small stores and very small buildings on the main street, which were perfect for people that needed low rent, small stores, and then high density gives you anonymity, lots of bachelor and one bedroom units that kind of allow you to kind of escape small town life to the anonymous but exciting big city. And all of that kind of helped form Church Street, what we see today. The other big thing was when the CBC moved out of that neighborhood, used to have a lot of production studios, and Maple Leafs moved down to the Air Canada Centre, or Scotiabank Arena now. That left a lot of steakhouses in the area starting to close down, because there was a lot of places to serve the executives, and those became queer bars. So the infrastructure was there for the restaurants and the bars that we see today. So, it could have happened anywhere, but nowhere, but it was very lucky. The kind of right mix of things were happening in that neighborhood to make it form. But definitely a lot of lessons there about the importance of those small shops on main streets and the really high density around it to support this very vibrant neighborhood that we see today.
That makes me think of, here in Vancouver, we have the West End, and what they're doing now. Like, it's historically been sort of the same situation, and I've lived in the West End. It's a great neighborhood, I have to say. If I had my choice, that's where I'd be living, in downtown. But But what they've done is they're putting in high rises now, but for the longest time, people were fighting it. It's just a sense of affordability, I guess, more than anything else, because for exactly the same reason you said, people come from small towns, and this is a safe space for them to live relatively cheaply downtown. How much of that is sort of in I don't know if conflict's the right word, but is that happening on Church Street and other similar neighborhoods where the developers are coming in and building stuff, and are they keeping in mind what that neighborhood is and the history of it?
Oh, I mean, Joel lives in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So he can.
Fair enough. I can speak as a resident.
Sure, please do.
I mean, the church in Wellesley Village is certainly going through another transformation. You know, the zoning right now in Toronto really only makes development possible in very few places of the city. And unfortunately, the church in Wellesley Village is one of those zones. So there aren't necessarily the thoughts of how do we protect these small businesses, which at the end, these queer businesses are all small businesses, all community organizations, which are now sitting in very, very expensive, high development land where, you know, you could build a 60-story tower. We're seeing those tensions happening, but those tensions, you know, have been in the neighborhood for a long time before it was the queer village. You know, I live in the towers that are called Village Green, and they are now considered kind of a bit of a queer icon for the city. But the newspapers in the 1960s were talking about, you know, how horrendous they were and how tall they were and the shadows they would project and ruin the neighborhood. So the discussion has been around for a while. I think the question of how do we keep the village vibrant, though, is something everyone's struggling with, because we know we need more spaces for people to live. It is a great connected neighborhood. It's just where does that development happen? Where's the right place to place it? And, you know, maybe it's not on those main avenues. Maybe it is on those mid blocks, which is what we saw really worked in the 1960s and 70s for the neighborhood. So I think it's there. I think sometimes the conversation isn't as nuanced probably as it should be, because queer spaces is also a story of transformation. Almost every one of the institutions that we researched, from Buddies in Bad Times to Glad Day, they have moved several times throughout their history. Their village locations are all relatively recent.
And ad hoc transformations too. I mean, the who was it that moved overnight? Was it Zelda's?
Zelda's, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's, yeah.
So there's a lot of things that you know, change also seems to be one of those things that is part of queer spaces. And I guess we're now struggling for the first time in history with what are there permanent queer spaces and what does that mean and how do we maintain them?
Another question I had is, it's easier if you're young enough to forget that a lot of this is birthed out of struggle, and well, not all of it really. Like for instance, Stonewall in the States was that's where Pride comes from, I assume, unless I'm getting my history wrong, and that was a riot. So how much of that comes into play in Toronto, where people were like, "No, you're not taking our space"?
Yeah, I mean that is it's a very similar story in Canada. You know, the U.S. had the Stonewall riots in New York. We had Operation Soap in Toronto, which was the raiding of 4 bathhouses.
Right.
Of which I think only one still exists to this day and still operates to this day. So they have been able to survive kind of beyond that era. And I think there's definitely that concept right now driving the village on, like, you know, keeping the space. Like, we've taken up the space, so we want to make sure it doesn't get lost. And how do you balance that is with rising rent costs that the village is facing. It's a big struggle, but definitely I think seeing more permanence of those spaces has been a big deal.
And finally, I would ask, in terms of heritage, like obviously, I'm pretty sure the community is preserving its own heritage as much as it possibly can. But how much is the city of Toronto or the province of Ontario doing to help out with that sort of thing?
Well, the city did commission a report looking at this, because I think from their perspective, the cultural heritage of the village has obviously some economic value as well. Like Toronto hosted World Pride, which is this massive event that brought in a lot of people and a lot of tax dollars for the city. I don't know. I mean, going back
Yeah.
to Joel, like, what's happening on the ground now? I mean, there's like movements to get heritage status for some of these buildings in the village.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say there are some people in the community that are working very hard to get buildings heritage designated. I think kind of one of the bigger questions that we're all facing is, what is exactly that heritage? Is it the building, or is it the institutions and organizations behind it? And is there a way that we could preserve those while creating new spaces? That I don't think the city has been able to quite figure out. How can we, what does heritage look like when our heritage isn't the building itself, but the people inside that building?
It's kind of funny seeing the histories of some of these buildings, because their queerness is only a small sliver of the history of the building. Most of the history of a lot of these are like Victorian houses or something or other, and only very, very recently in the lifespan of these buildings have they really become queer spaces. So it's kind of interesting seeing them get heritage designations, because it's not necessarily the queerness of the space in its current use that is
right.
And it brings a question, with the work that sometimes comes with maintaining a heritage structure. Can the organizations that live inside of these buildings be able to afford those costs? I think so. Personally, I'd like to see more work from both the city and the province of thinking about heritage beyond the built environment, which is kind of crazy coming from architecture. But sometimes the people are more important than the buildings.
And I guess the last thing I would ask is, Pride is not just a month. For instance, it's not having till August here in Vancouver. So if people are interested in this topic of discussion, or just generally in architecture and LGBTQ issues, where should they go to find out more?
Yeah, so actually we do have some resources that are on demand, both on our website and on our Instagram. So on our website, we have a playlist, which is our free to stream curated playlist on architecture and the built environment. And there's one on queer space, which also has a recording of a panel discussion we did last year on queer space in the city, featuring designers and architects from all over Toronto that were working on queer projects. And on our Instagram, on our stories highlight, there is a queer spaces tour of Toronto with all the buildings that were in Pride this year, where you can learn a little bit more about them and how they went from steakhouses to bars to everything in between. So we try to maintain kind of that information, those resources available to everyone year round. And we're always publishing on our social media channels as we are learning more things, because we have some exciting projects getting ready for 2023.
Yes, and our social media handle, because I got to plug that, is at TosoArch, or at TOSOARCH. And you'll find this what Joel was just mentioning there.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for joining us today, guys.
Well, thank you so much.